Hello and welcome to this third video in the series where we're looking at Halion Sonic's Flux Wavetable Synth. In this video we're going to be taking a look at the arpeggiator, and initial warning, it's a pretty complicated subject, so we're not going to be looking at everything in complete detail, because if we did that, it'd probably take about an hour, I think. So we're going to look at everything, but perhaps not every detailed option available for every step. But with that in mind, let's have a look at the Mac and see what the basic setup is. So here you can see Flux, and hopefully, as you can see, we've got just a simple one oscillator on the comb square waveform. The filter's turned off. In fact, let's totally turn it off, but it wasn't doing anything anyway. So it's just a pretty basic sound, because that's what we're interested in, not the sound. We're interested in the arpeggiator. So at the moment, it's going to be in mono mode. Some of the time, this will be taken out of mono mode. So this is on the voice tab here. So sometimes we'll be playing it in mono mode like this. And sometimes it will be in poly mode, like that. It will depend on what's happening with the arpeggiator. So here we are in the arpeggiator page, and the first thing to do is to turn it on with the on-off button here. And the second thing is we are not going to use it initially in the user mode. So it defaults to being in user mode a lot of the time. Let's take it out of user mode by clicking this, and then we're in preset mode. Slightly confusing because you don't sort of get to see that it's in preset mode, but we're going to start out in preset mode. So turning that off allows us to pick up any of the presets which are here. Now you'll also notice that in user mode you get a different set of presets. So here we are, and you can see there's quite a lot to play around with. So we've got lots of menus and sub-menus, etc. So we're just going to start by loading up a simple one, alternate one, and playing a C major chord on the keyboard. This is what we get. So this is pretty basic. So you can see we've got a few different options here. The first one, which is fairly useful, is hold. So I'm going to press the keys and I'm releasing them. So you can see at the bottom of the screen maybe that I've released them, but it's still going. So this can be useful if you want to play around with a couple of other controls, etc., or just have this repeating forever. Let's turn that off. Trigger mode immediately, so you can have this immediately next beat or next measure. So this can be useful. So if you need to pre-play the chords, they won't trigger exactly at the time. They can trigger on the beat or the next bar, etc., which can be pretty useful. Restart mode is whether or not the arpeggiator restarts, depending on your setting here, and also variation change if you're using that. And key mode, so we've got sort, which is generally what you'd want, because that will sort them from low to high. So the timing of which you play them doesn't make any difference. So generally that's pretty much what you want, because it's more predictable. As played, we'll play them in the order they're played. So if you play the middle note of your chord before the others, then that's the one that will be counted as the first note of the phrase. And then direct is a little more esoteric. So this sends controller events instead of notes. So you hear the notes that you play and any controller events, etc. So that's certainly not something I've messed around with too much. So velocity mode, we've got original, which means it follows the velocities of the arpeggiator phrase, actually. As played is how you played them, and then it's a combination with original and as played. So we've got some ability to control that to a degree. Those controls, I haven't spent an enormous amount of time playing around with. The scale is obviously pretty important, because this will control the basic speed of your arpeggio. So in this case, we're on 16ths. If I double that up, we're suddenly into the sort of crazy synth solo in the original Bill tune, etc. So we've got all these variations, which are pretty useful. So I'm going to stick back to 16ths. These four knobs are probably the go-to controls. So you've got swing, and as we turn this up, you'll hear that. In fact, I'm going to put this to 8 so it's a little more noticeable. So we've got up to heavy swing, and we can have anti-swing, as you would expect. Gate scale. So we'll come back to this a bit later on, but this basically controls how much % of the original arpeggio note length is preserved. So at the moment it's 100, so they will play at their normal lengths. But if I bring this down, let's put that back to 16ths. If I bring this down, you can hear they're just getting shorter, so we can go down to supposedly 1%. And we can make them longer. Now with this, if we go to mono mode, you will hear that now they will overlap and therefore be played in kind of fingered legato mode as well. So that's one of the tricks you can use to make this work, and we'll see that in a little more detail a bit later on. So I'm going to put it back into poly mode. Velocity scale is the scaling of velocity from, so you can control that. And octaves, typical for an arpeggiator. So you can get all those big. So we can go down as well as up, which is quite nice, although there are some limits to this kind of thing. But yeah, you've got those basic controls there for controlling these arpeggiator patterns. Now to browse these, it can initially seem a little bit awkward. It's best to do it by summoning this and then clicking and hitting enter, which means that gets loaded. But you don't close the window, so we can browse through these reasonably quickly. You get the idea there. Now, we've also got these low key and high key. Now, these are actually quite useful because you can set up a range where you will be able to arpeggiate and others where you won't. So at the moment, the C on my keyboard is C3. And if we set this to be below that, so if I just bring that down, if I set it to B2, this will no longer be arpeggiated. So you can see that's a normal note, whereas if I play the B, you can hear the arpeggiator playing, and obviously if I play a chord below there. So you can set those key ranges. You could set the low range as well, but I'm not going to do that. I'm going to put this back to G8. And you can do the same with velocity as well, but I'm not going to mess with that, but you could do that. So maybe if you hit notes really hard, they wouldn't get arpeggiated, whereas everything else would. So you can play around with that. One really useful feature here is that you can record whatever you've done in the arpeggiator and then drag that as a MIDI part to a MIDI or instrument track in Cubase for further editing, repetition, etc. So that's what we're going to look at next. So let's just have a simple arpeggio here. So you can just hear that playing. Nothing particularly interesting, but we'll record it just for the sake of it. So all you need to do is to hit the record output, and then I'm just going to hold down chord for a couple of cycles. And then turn record off. And now this is recorded. I can drag from here onto MIDI track or instrument track, and you can see that's been recorded there. And you could then edit that as you want to. So that's the basis of the preset mode. So there's hundreds, possibly thousands of combinations there, because there's hundreds of presets, and there's all those controls. Even if you just use those 4 knobs at the bottom and played around with those, you can see there's a fair bit of variation there. But for me, that's not really where the interest lies. The interest in the arpeggiator part of Flux lies in the user mode, and that's a little more complicated, but that's where we're headed next. For me, user mode is where it's at with the arpeggiator in Flux, and indeed this is carried across to multiple other Steinberg products which are included with the full version of Halion, and it's got a lot of power, but as with anything with a lot of power, there's a bit of a learning curve, and there's a few little tricks which will probably help you get along a bit better with it. So first up, let's switch into user mode and take a quick look around. So switching into user mode is pretty straightforward. We just press the user button, funnily enough. So as you can see, this area of the display has now come to life, and there's a few things we can do. So first thing is the length of the arpeggio, because at the moment our arpeggio is 1/16 long because we've just got one step activated. So we can change the length. I'm going to change it, well, I could change it up to 32, but I'm just going to change it to 8 for the time being. And when I play a note, I'm just going to stick with playing single notes for reasons which will hopefully become apparent a bit later on. We can see the steps as they play. So there's your first step. Now, we can set the velocities as the display here shows. We're showing the velocity lane. So we can alter these. You can just click and drag these. So I'm just going to have this on a sort of on-off. And if we get this a bit higher, you'll hear those second notes. So you can hear that there. There's a number of things we can do to this. We can hold down the Alt key and then you can draw a line. So you can see if you start in one position and then hold down Alt, but it starts from the column that you're on. So if we wanted this to be high, we'd hold down the Alt key now and then there we go. We can do that. If you hold down the Control or Command key if you're on a Mac, then that will reset that to full. If you click up here, it resets this. So that can get pretty annoying. You have to be pretty precise with this. And this is definitely one of those synths where I wish I had a fully resizable user interface because it's a little bit pernickety. But let's just set those up. And now we can hear that. So we're hearing that effect as those other velocities come up. Now you can also set pitches of each step, and this is where it can get a little bit complicated because there's actually two modes which can work at the same time, but you can only see one of them. So hopefully taking you through this will make it a little more simple. I think often you just use the first mode, and that's certainly what I did for the first time that I spent playing around with this, but then the second mode is definitely somewhere where you can have a lot more control. So let's first look at the simple pitch change mode. So here, this is actually a button. So we've either got transpose or key select. So we're going to stick in transpose mode when we've got this note. And basically, this is just semitone transposition of any of these steps. So let's just make this one 3 and this one 7. So we get sort of an outline of, and this one 12, in fact. So we get an outline of a minor chord. And you can hear those echoes, as it were, underneath. And that already sounds okay. Sounds like we've got a delay in there, even though we haven't. So that's the basis of that. You've got a reasonable amount of range, 3 octaves up, 3 octaves down on either of these. You can double click and type them in, or you can click and drag to change them. It's a bit, again, it's a bit pernickety. I often find I end up just double clicking and typing in what I want in there. So that's fairly straightforward, but the other mode where you can pick keys is a little more complicated, but also much more powerful. So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to reset these back to 0, purely because there will be less confusion that way, because we can combine the two. But if we click here, we now get different characters here. So we get either P, A, or 1, 2, 3, or 4. So this allows us to pick particular parts of the chord which has been played. So if you leave it on P, it will play whatever pattern is selected here. So at the moment we're in up, but I'm just going to do, in fact, no, I'm going to leave that on up just for the sake of it. So if I play this, as we go through the steps, it's going to go, because I'm going to play 3 notes in the chord, it's going to go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and then it will go 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, and so on. So if I play that, we'll hear it, and after 3 times round, it will come back to the beginning. So there we go. That's gone back round again. Now, at the moment, that's just picking the same patterns that it would do from this pattern here. So if we change this, if we change it to down, it does that. Now, you can change these here. So instead, we can change it to number 1. So if we change all of these, let's just change all of these to number 1, all the first ones to number 1. So the first one, we're going to hear the first note of the chord, and because it's sorted, this will be the bottom note of the chord. And here we'll hear whatever was in the pattern. So you hear that we got dun, 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 you know, you hear that pattern there, and then you're hearing the arpeggiator pattern. So we're hearing the root note of the chord and then the arpeggiator pattern, because P means play whatever was in the pattern. And it took 3 cycles to go round because of the way that 3 notes maps onto the 8 steps here. So far, so good. Now, we can also pick another part of the chord. So we've got 2, 3, or 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, L, and then A. Okay, now A means play everything in that chord. So if we play it this time, on this step, we're going to get the whole chord. So we get the pattern for 2, we get the root note for 4, the pattern for 2, the whole chord, and then the pattern. You can play around with that to your heart's content. There's lots of things we can do with this, but we can combine it with Transpose as well. So let's say we want to make these first ones here a different octave. So let's make this one down an octave. So we put -12 on that. We'll go back to there so you can see it, but this one is going to be down an octave. Etc. So you've got loads and loads of control over this. So hopefully you can see there's quite a lot of power in this system. It means you've got access to what notes were played in the chord, and you can have a mixture of the original pattern or being specific about what's happening at any particular point, including playing a chord and transposing those notes as well. So with a bit of experimentation and a bit of time, you'll be able to come up with all sorts of things. Now, you could probably come up with a riff which you can play in different keys and automate the creation of an entire song. And don't forget, of course, once you've done that, you can always record it to MIDI, export it to Cubase, and then change anything you need, such as making it work particularly well with, let's say, a major or minor chord. If you have any little glitches in there, it's often much easier to do that rather than reprogram another arpeggiator pattern to do it for you. So now we've got a pattern which is reasonably complicated, but maybe we want to change and extend. So we can use these tools here. Now, these are really useful. The first one shifts everything left and it wraps around. So you can see we've moved one step to the left, and this was the original first step. That does the opposite way, so we can just move this around as many times as we want. This reverses it. So you see now we've got these going down, which is, again, pretty useful. And with a combination of these, you can make sure you're accenting the right thing, etc. Duplicate phrase is really useful. So this will duplicate whatever you've got, extend it perfectly. And this can be really useful when you want to have, let's say, a different ending. So let's say we want to have a quiet chord on that one, and now we'll hear that. So you can hear the difference between the two. Again, pretty simple stuff, but it makes it much faster and much easier to achieve what you want to do. One thing you may have issues with is that the key select mode is not available if you're in step or chord. So if we go into step here, you see this all blanks out because that's not compatible with that, nor is chord mode, but the others all are. So sometimes you might find maybe you've loaded up a preset which disables that, and that's often the reason why that's been disabled. So that's something to watch out for. Next up, note lengths. So there's two ways we can control the note lengths. You've already seen that we've got the gate scale here. If I play a chord, and we can make these longer. So if you make these longer, if I play a mono phrase, in fact, if I take this, I'll take this back to, let's say, 3. So then we're not going to get a chord coming out of it, and we go back into mono mode. Because our gate scale is over 100, all of these are legato. They're all overlapping, so it's all like fingered legato. So let's put this back to 100. There is a legato step button here, so we can make these legato by pressing the numbers. And you can hear that legato in there where it's going between those. It varies depending on what you've got happening. But you can certainly hear it where we're going from P to 1. So you can hear that there, and you can play around with that. So that's one way to alter note lengths and get some legato happening, but there's another way we can do it where we can control much more than that. It's a little bit fiddly at first and can be a little bit frustrating, but it's worth sticking with because it gives you so much control. So let's have a look at that. If you've been eagle-eyed, you may have noticed that if you hover your mouse over the right-hand edge of any block, you can click and change its length by dragging that. That gives you the ability to control this length in terms of a % of the block size, but also you can make a step bigger than an original block by, it's got a bit of stickiness to it, but you can see it overlaps, and handily it turns it back on if you make a mistake, as it were. But yeah, you can control that, so this block will be longer. So here, it's not so noticeable with that one, but let's turn that back on. And let's make this one really short. So you can hear that effect there. Now, handily, there's a right-click menu. So if you right-click here, we can do something such as fill gap, which will fill the gap until the next step, which is present. We could fill all gaps, reset lengths, reset all lengths, etc. So this is pretty useful. Now, one thing you might know is if you do reset step, if you are not over a step, it will reset all of them. So that can be a bit annoying, particularly if you've just spent ages doing a load of stuff. You'll be pleased to know that up here, there's an undo, and Command Z or Control Z undoes. So handily, we can just undo any mistakes. If you do the same thing more times and it doesn't have any effect, you need to undo more steps, because you can try and do the same thing more than one time and not get anywhere. But it works pretty well. It's got me out of quite a few tight spots with this. So yeah, we can adjust these lengths. Now, if you hold down the Shift key, you can adjust all of the lengths proportionally. So there we've made them all shorter, and then I'm just going to make this one longer. So now that one's going to be the only one that's full length. So we can see you can control that pretty well. So Shift works pretty well for that. You can also use Shift to control velocities by holding down Shift and adjusting one of them, and it will adjust them relatively. So depending on which one you grab hold of, you can see if I grab that one, that's the bottom value I can go to, etc. So with a bit of care, you can do a lot of control with just that kind of thing. And we can set this up. So let's just make this a little bit lower overall, and then make this one higher and this one higher. And again, that pattern will now accent the first of each beat, etc. So if we add in some gate scaling and turn this up, then this one will then be played legato, because that will be overlapping on this and all the others won't. So we can turn this up a bit. Maybe just turn the velocity up on that so we hear it. Maybe take that down an octave. Yeah, so you can hear that working there. So you can create legato in a number of different ways. I've generally found that actually working with this gate scaling and altering the lengths of these individually has worked a little better than using step legato on and off, because it seems to give them more control over it. But your mileage will probably vary on this, I'm sure. Another useful little feature on this arpeggiator is the ability to import groove timing from a MIDI clip. So that's what we're going to look at next. So here you can see the previous arpeggiator setup working exactly as before. And here is a groove. Now, if we just take a look at this briefly in the editor, this has just been set up just for the sake of it, but every fourth note is swung, whereas all the others aren't. So these ones aren't swung. So at the moment, the grid is set to show that swing. So this is 25% swing on that. That hasn't got any swing. You couldn't set that up with swing from within the arpeggiator, because it changes depending on where we are. But you can take this. This would just be an example. So if you had something where you had a human timing in there, you could take that. But this is just a simple example so you can see and hear this working. So to bring this in, all you need to do is to click on that part and bring it, and you can see when we get over there, we get a plus. This lights up, and now when I play it, you'll hear every fourth note will be late. So it sounds a bit different, and if you've seen those drum grooves, which I mentioned many moons ago on the channel, then you'll be able to use these to bring in those grooves and the feel of those classic drum machines to make your arpeggiator follow those feels exactly. You can pick how much of this groove is useful, so you can have it from nothing. So there you can hear it's just absolutely plain. 100%. So you can hear it does feel just a bit different. It's pretty subtle, but then maybe you want a bit less than that. So 50% will be half that timing. So that's another useful way for getting this sounding more organic, possibly a little more analog, but certainly, say, if you've got some interesting grooves, whether they're created by people or by old machines which weren't perfectly in time, you can import them into here and then use those as you would expect. So far, we've used Flux as a pretty standard arpeggiator, albeit one with plenty of features, as you've already seen. But the eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed there is a C1, C2 and C3 buttons at the top, and that is where we can use it to create controller messages, as you're going to see in this next section. So here, by changing to controller 1, we can see we get a bit of a change. So all of these steps are still valid, but the thing which will actually be output here will just be the values of controller that we're drawing. Now, these are going to be done in exactly the same way as we've seen before. So you can just hold down your mouse button and move your mouse around, or you can use the Alt key to draw a straight line, etc., that kind of thing. But notice that these are continual steps now. So we can't put little steps in there. We're not dealing with notes. We're just outputting some controller information. So just to make this simple, I'm just going to have this rising up. Now, by default, this is routed to pitch. So we actually get extra modulation slots here. So if you've seen the previous video, you'll know that we've got 16 modulation slots. But actually, you've got more than that, because we've got the arpeggiator C1, C2, and C3 have also got a modulation slot specifically for them. So this has been set to be pitch, so just for fun, just so you can see the effect. It's not going to be musical. I'm going to set that to 12. I'm going to play it, and you'll hear that this is going to go probably crazy. So it sounds a lot like an Atari 2600 when you do that kind of thing, because it's all kind of out of tune, because obviously these are arbitrary values between no pitch change and 12 semitones of pitch change, and none of them are on particularly musical values. Obviously, there is more you can do with this, and if you pick here, you can see we've got all of those destinations that we previously saw in the modulation video, so we can do something more interesting. So now I am going to turn the filter on, so let's put that to cut off. Let's go back to the filter here, and let's bring the cutoff down. Go back to this here, and now you can hear that opening up. I'm going to make it more severe. And let's take the filter down further. So you can hear that that's working on there. And we've got 3 of these, exactly the same. So C2 and C3, they've got their own destination that you can choose. If you want to do more than that with them, remember that on the modulation page, if we turn that on, we can pick ARP controller 1, 2, or 3. So if you want to route it somewhere else, send it to a bus, use it to control multiple destinations, you can do that. So you've got a total of 19 modulation slots, because you've got 16 here and then the 3 for the individual controllers. So that gives you a bit more flexibility, allows you to do a lot more with the arpeggiator. So that's a look around most of the features of the user mode. The last thing is probably what most people would think of as the first thing, which is that there are presets. Now, these presets are different to the presets in preset mode. So the useful thing about them is you can learn a lot from them, because there's quite a few interesting techniques, and sometimes you'll load one up and go, how are they doing that? So for instance, you'll get them where they've combined the key access mode and the transpose, so you'll get an interesting keyboard pattern, that kind of thing. So let's take a look at a couple of those and just break down how they're working, because it helps you understand how this arpeggiator works and also how powerful it is. So before we take a look at the presets themselves, just a brief word about the variation slots which are available. So there are 8, as you've seen here. We've been using number 1, and numbers 2 through 8 are all blank, as we started out at the beginning of the video. You can copy and paste between slots, so by selecting this one, and it's important that you click in the right place. So if I had this selected, but then right-clicked or 2-finger tapped on a different one, that would be the one I'm copying. So got to be careful with your position, but I'm going to copy that there, and then I'm going to click on number 3, but I don't actually need to, but I'm going to, just so we see it happen. So again, get the right-click menu up, and then paste that FlexPhraser variation, because that's what they refer to the arpeggiator as fully. And that's pasted that in. And then I can change this to my heart's content, and I can always go back to number 1 if I want to. So let's change to another slot. And now we're going to load up Dance Arp 01. We need to be in poly mode for this because it's got some chords in there, and the reason you can tell that is if we change this to key select, we can see we've got these A's which play chords. So what this is going to play is a chord, then the root note, an arpeggio, root note, chord, etc. And if we go back to velocity, we can see why this is happening. So we've got these longer steps here and so on. So you can play around with that kind of thing. Obviously, we're just using this with a pretty basic sound. There's nothing interesting happening, but it will be a useful basis to start something more worthwhile with. Let's have a look at another one. Again, we can see we've got A and 1. Play it a bit lower. Now, if you combine that with an interesting sound, you'll probably have a kind of song starter thing happening. And because you know what you're doing with this now, you'll be able to play around and customize this for your needs. Or, of course, always you can record this, drag it out to a track, and away you go. So the control arps are pretty interesting because they don't have anything in the way of note control. So we can see here, we're not doing anything with the notes at all, but they do have controller information in here, and providing you've got the filter turned on, so here the filter is turned on, then when we play this, you'll hear the filter being modulated. And there are often variations on that kind of thing. So here we've got a note in there as well. So while they don't have any note information in there, they do have some pre-made filter modulation, etc. in there, and then you can program in your own note changes and arpeggiators using the skills you've seen already in this video. So there you have it, a whistle-stop but kind of in-depth tour of the Halion Sonic Flux Arpeggiator page. Now that arpeggiator is used across multiple Steinberg products. So if you know it here, you'll be able to use those skills to give you a step up on quite a few other synths. Remember that this is only one part of the synth, so you've got the interest created from the wavetables, you've then got modulation, which you can use to make the sounds evolve, and then you've got musical and also control modulation, which you can do using the arpeggiator page. And between those three sections, you really should be able to program some pretty interesting sounds with what is, let's remember, a free synth. So, as ever, I hope you found this useful, and if you have, please consider liking and subscribing, and we'll see you again soon for more Music Tech Tuition.